Hello, everybody, and welcome to this UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour. I'm Jill Rutt. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UK and a Changing Europe. Today, we're previewing a new report which is going to be published next week on regulating after Brexit. It's our look at how the UK has behaved as an independent regulator outside the EU using those new opportunities, flexibilities we've had since 2020. To do that, I'm joined by Joel Rolland, Senior Researcher at UK and a Changing Europe, and the principal, and indeed more or less the only author of this report, certainly the lead author, Professor Sarah Hall, who's actually also contributed quite a lot from UK and Change Europe and the University of Cambridge, Professor David Bailey, UK and Changing Europe and Birmingham Business School. And I'm delighted that we're also joined by Neil Ross from Public First. Remember, you can ask questions away on Slido, type your questions. But please, if you see a quite good question that's more or less the same as you would ask, just upvote that one rather than ask a new question. Then I can see where audience members are really, really seriously interested. So let's kick off. Joel, you've spent a lot of the time since Brexit looking at where the UK is getting to on regulation and how it's faring, tracking divergence in your excellent, though slightly more sporadic, usually quarterly divergence tracker. So how far have we actually diverged from the EU since Brexit?
Well, the very short answer is not very much at all. So if you go into our report, you'll see a chart which tracks the number of proposals for regulatory divergence since the TCA took effect. And what you see is that chart goes up and up and up under the Boris Johnson regime. More and more ideas are coming forwards. And then it kind of crashes back down around the time that he leaves office and is replaced by Liz Truss and then Rishi Sunak. And ultimately, while there are a lot of ideas for things to do differently, there's very little of substance which has actually been delivered. If I were to kind of point to the main things which have changed, I think they're primarily symbolic things which give a feeling of sovereignty, but don't really change very much in practice. Like, for example, being allowed to sell champagne in pint-sized bottles or to sell flour with imperial weights and measures on the front, as well as grams. And that points to a lot of the complexities which come with divergence, the economic costs, which I think we'll get into later on. And then maybe a handful of more substantive changes that's also emerged. We had, for example, a ban on the export of live animals, the removal of the banker's bonus cap, and also a few areas where the UK was obliged to do things differently because it was no longer part of an EU regime. So, for example, there was a new immigration system which the UK had to impose to control immigration from the EU, which has led actually to a massive increase in net migration, which is something not many people expected. Changes to rules around subsidies compared to what the EU does, and also a new system for farm subsidies, farm payments, replacing the common agricultural policy. So, a handful of things with the change, but nothing which has dramatically, revolutionized the economy in the way that Boris Johnson promised when he delivered this TCA, emphasizing the UK was going to become radically different and the best regulated economy in the world, as he put it.
So we've had quite a few prime ministers since the TCA was signed. Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, arguably not really there quite long enough to make that much of a difference. Rishi Sunak and now Keir Starmer. So have those different administrations adopted very different approaches to divergence?
So for me, the critical turn was under Rishi Sunak, where I think there was a recognition that divergence had more economic costs than benefits, at least in the immediate term for business. And what we saw was an abandonment of some of the more radical plans for divergence. For example, a UK-specific conformity assessment mark that you would need instead of an EU mark on your products. And there was a recognition that that was not good for business, and we're going to get rid of it. And we saw a significant diminution in the amount of attempts to diverge from the EU. And I think that's a philosophy which is shared by this Labour government, but there are a couple of important turns which you now have under Labour. So one of those is a willingness to actually get closer to the EU. So not just to stop trying to diverge, but to actively do things to try and minimize existing divergence. So we're now seeing talk about the UK wanting to negotiate an agreement on SPS standards, which would remove a regulatory it would harmonize the UK and EU regulations to remove technical barriers to trade on plant and animal goods. So that's about reducing existing divergence. And also, I think the other important thing, which I haven't mentioned yet, is this concept of passive divergence, which is where the EU changes its rules and the UK doesn't follow. And that creates a difference by default because Great Britain is on one set of rules and the EU and very often Northern Ireland is on another. Again, the Sunak administration didn't really do much to address passive divergence other than promising to try and avoid it. Whereas this Labour government is looking to do active things to reduce it in some areas via something called the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, which would give the government significant powers to more or less sort of replicate EU regulations in order to maintain parity on the UK statute. But we don't quite know how they're going to use that yet. But it's a clear attempt to minimise that passive divergence to both help UK-EU trade and to avoid new differences between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which the government seems quite sensitive to.
Okay, so that's the general picture. Let's just drill down a bit into different sectors. Sarah, one of the reasons we saw those arguments before Brexit between Philip Hammond and the Bank of England about, checkers, about whether the UK should accept being inside the single market or whether the UK needed to maintain control of financial services regulation, with the Treasury and the bank appearing to be on different sides on that one. Have we seen a lot of divergence on the way in which we're approaching financial services, or are we very much in step with the EU?
So, and in terms of divergence, I think one of the kind of most significant elements of divergence, as Joelle mentioned, was the removal of the banker's bonus cap. And when I was speaking, so that's a limit on how much or the proportion of pay that can be paid through bonuses in financial institutions. And it was implemented in the wake of the 2007-8 crisis to try and prevent undue risk-taking in the sector. And when I was talking to people working in the sector very shortly after the UK left the EU, and I'd asked them, where are the opportunities that the then Johnson government was pushing for in terms of regulatory autonomy and potentially divergence in financial services? And they would all say, the banker's bonus cap is the most obvious. It was quite unpopular within the sector for obvious reasons. But what was most interesting was how long it took the UK to actually remove the banker's bonus cap. And for a long time, they just felt it would be kind of politically unpalatable to remove the bonus cap. I think it's diminished a little bit, but at that time, there was still this sense that had the financial services sector been made to pay enough of a price for the 2007-8 crisis, and the government didn't want to be seen to be kind of rewarding bankers. So eventually that was revoked. But I think the rather than the kind of revocation being the most interesting part of that, the amount of time it took is the most interesting part of that. And that really is the story of what's happened with financial services post-Brexit. So in your question, you were clear that financial services knew quite early on what Brexit would mean for them in a way that's quite different to like automotive, for example, that David will talk about. So they knew as soon as the UK said, we are not going to accept freedom of movement, the EU was very clear then that the UK could not kind of have its cake and eat it. It wouldn't be able to cherry pick a sort of preferential rate of market access for UK financial services compared to other third countries. And so when I think about what divergence looks like in financial services, I think of it very much as a kind of long Brexit. So the financial services sector had a long time to prepare. It knew it wouldn't be able to service EU markets from its London or UK base as it had in the past. And so you saw companies relocating offices or activity, at least, into the EU mainland. Then there was a discussion about whether this might lead to a kind of really radical deregulation of UK financial services, the so-called Singapore-on-Thames model. I think there's something quite interesting there, because if you talk to experts on Singapore, they say actually that in many ways Singapore is quite highly regulated. So that kind of is a bit of a misnomer. But nevertheless, we haven't seen radical deregulation or divergence compared to what's happened in the EU. I think in some instances, you can see that financial services were given preferential focus by the government. I think the most obvious example of that is the Financial Services and Markets Act of 2023. And perhaps we can go into that in more detail in due course. But basically, that meant that there was actually a plan in terms of what would happen to financial services regulation in a way that there wasn't in other sectors that were subject to the kind of great kind of revocation of onshoring of EU regulation. So financial services, I think, because of this question and need to protect economic stability, were given preferential treatment. And there was a plan through the Financial Services Markets Act in terms of what UK regulation would look like. What is actually...
Sorry, Sarah. I was just going to say, is Rachel Reeves trying to do anything very different from what Jeremy Hunt was wanting to do? We had Jeremy Hunt talking about Edinburgh reforms. Not quite sure
Yes.
what was in the Edinburgh reforms. Is Rachel Reeves still in Edinburgh, or has she gone somewhere else?
So I think in lots of ways there is continuity, and here I would follow Joelle's sort of wider observation that it's really under the Sunak administration in particular that he unlocked the potential for if not alignment, at least greater dialogue between what was happening for regulators in the EU and the UK. That led us, his unlocking and the Windsor framework led to the Edinburgh reforms, which was a big kind of statement on where the UK would go on financial services regulation. And what you're starting to see now are more of a kind of piecemeal approach, like by different types of financial services regulation, looking at the relationship between the EU and the UK. So it's not that helpful to think of financial services as a whole if you want to think about the extent to which the UK is diverging or not. The picture's quite different depending on what part of financial services you look at. So, for example, the UK has delayed, compared to the EU, its implementation of major international banking reforms. They're called Basel III. So there had been an expectation that the UK might try and or would implement those at the same time as the EU, thereby, in essence, aligning regulation in that part of financial services. The UK has adopted a different timescale, which actually gives it more time to think about how the US is implementing these international banking reforms. So in that sector, you would say there's a little bit that looks more like divergence. Similarly, there's been a review recently looking at credit card processing charges. This might not seem like the most kind of exciting thing to be talking about on a Sunday, Tuesday afternoon, but outside of the EU, the UK could apply different charges to credit card companies when it took an international transaction. That's an area that the EU is looking at quite closely in terms of what that might mean for European financial services providers trying to sell into the UK market. But then so you have those elements that look a little bit more like divergence. On the other hand, you see some evidence of convergence, and Joel's brilliant on this, that convergence can come both from the EU and the UK side. So the EU has essentially extended the one market access instrument that's in place that allows EU financial firms to use UK clearinghouses. It had been adamant that this was going to kind of expire imminently, and it has now extended that. So you're seeing a little bit more recognition of the reliance of EU financial services on UK markets. And going back to the kind of unlocking of the relationship, what Sunak managed to deliver, which is really important in financial services, is he managed to get the Memorandum of Understanding on Financial Services, which was attached to the TCA, up and running in terms of setting up regulatory dialogue between the UK and the EU. So this was paused up until that point, despite being attached to the TCA. And in February just gone, they had their third meeting. So at one level, you might say that's a kind of regulator talking shop. But I think that there are signs that in some areas, there are elements of recognition that the two sides might be moving in a similar direction. So a kind of greater interest, particularly in proportionality in regulation. So by that, we mean, like, can you apply something more appropriately to a small bank compared to a large bank, for example? So it's quite a sort of jigsaw effect, I would say, in financial services.
Okay, so we've got a jigsaw in financial services. David, what's it look like from the point of view of manufacturing? What have they seen? Is there substantive divergence? I've got a question as well for you, which I'm going to chuck in at the same time from John Pete. Is there a risk of getting, I'm not sure what John means by getting, whether this is prospective or where we are now, is there a risk of getting or having the worst of both worlds in goods? Little gain from regulatory divergence, but big loss of access to our largest market, by which I'm sure John means the EU. David, you're muted. No. Okay.
Might be my earphones.
Oh.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Fine, thank you. So the biggest change that was sort of highlighted was changes to the sort of subsidy control approach, which was seen as giving the UK more flexibility to support British manufacturers. And that was a kind of key argument from some Brexiters that EU rules constrain how we could support our companies. And certainly the UK has got a lighter touch approach in that sense, more streamlined and a kind of proceed until apprehended sort of attitude. In practice, that hasn't meant very much because we don't really do much in subsidies because we're so financially constrained, fiscally constrained at a governmental level. So that's potentially something that could be done differently in the future, but so far has had little real impact. We've seen passive divergence, as Joel referred to, in the sense that the EU has moved on in terms of its emissions trading system and moving towards a system of carbon border adjustment mechanism, which UK companies are going to have to comply with if they want to trade into the EU. And the UK is playing, as it were, catch up on developing a similar sort of system. And the question is, in the future, do we align them to avoid extra costs for UK manufacturing? We have seen a different approach in automotive, where almost as if the Department of Transport has said, post-Brexit, how do we make the UK an attractive place for investment in electric vehicles? So they came up with a more ambitious approach than the European Union, with a 2030 deadline for the banning of the internal combustion engine. The idea was to really signal a direction of travel and encourage investment in the UK. That hasn't worked for a number of reasons. One is Brexit itself created a lot of uncertainty. Secondly, high energy costs in the UK have deterred investment. And thirdly, we haven't really had an industrial strategy to really get big investment into the UK. And of course, most recently, the Starmer government have kind of backtracked on that in quite a big way, which they've packaged as a response to the Trump tariffs. So I think one of the other issues as well is that the trade and cooperation agreement had these various annexes, which were in many cases quite incomplete. We saw that with chemicals regulation, and that has led to a lot of uncertainty for the chemicals industry, a high cost of trying to recreate the chemicals database in the UK, rising cost estimates for that as high as 3.5 billion. Most recently, the government have been trying to cut the fees to register and selling that as a kind of a benefit, but essentially not that much in the way of divergence, really, but a lot of extra potential cost for business from having the government having the right to diverge. And we see that with the UK being outside the customs union, the single market, all the extra kind of customs declarations and rules of origin rules, which add extra cost to business. Now, coming back to John Pete's question, in a sense, one of the issues there is that we have the right to diverge. In practice, for business, that's a cost. And manufacturing business doesn't want, in many cases, divergence, because that means lots of disruption and extra cost for them. So we may end up kind of replicating EU rules, even though we have the right to diverge, because from a manufacturing point of view, it's too costly. So from John's point of view, do we end up in the worst possible world? Possibly. which raises the question, what do we do in the future? Which I know we're going to come back to later, but are there some sectors that we want to align? And I would argue that from a manufacturing point of view, that is often the case. Are there other parts of other sectors, like Sarah's been talking about, where actually divergence might be very useful? But we probably need some sort of strategy in government to actually think that through. I'm not sure government has really had the bandwidth to do that yet.
So we are getting the industrial strategy, aren't we, alongside the spending review in June. So David, could we have rescued Scunthorpe within the government, we didn't do it, within the EU's state aid rules, or?
That's a good question. Yes, I think we probably could have done. I mean, we've seen extensive intervention in steel in France, in Italy, and in Germany in all sorts of ways, in some cases through nationalisation, in some cases through part-time wage subsidies, energy compensation deals. I mean, the UK always kind of hid behind the state aid argument to say, well, we can't do that because of state aid rules, whereas other countries were doing it anyway. Where I think that the UK system was very useful was that when it finally came down to it, the government was able to act very, very quickly. Recalled Parliament, had that emergency legislation, was able to do something. So in the sense of it ultimately being able to act very quickly in a crisis, I think it was useful. I mean, sort of not having to notify that you're going to do state aid and simply get on with it was a useful thing. But if we'd been serious about steel all along, when the UK was in the European Union, we could have done much more to support it.
Okay, I'm going to come on to Neil now. So tech, I mean, this was supposed to be an area where regulation was moving very fast. The nimble UK, not needing to get the agreement of the other 27, could move super fast, get ahead of the game, be a leader, establish a bit of a London or UK effect where we came to write the rules on tech regulation and the dozy old EU would probably have to come in behind us, she says, maybe slightly exaggerating. But is that what it looks like now, sort of 4 or so years on from the TCA?
So it's a patchwork. This is probably the area where the UK has the most to celebrate on when it comes to divergence. And there's been both active and passive divergence, as Joel has talked about. So there's sort of broadly 4 big areas, that we need to think about, which is the EU's Digital Services Act and the UK equivalent, the Online Safety Act. That's about content regulation, online safety, etc. The Digital Markets Act and the UK's Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, which is about regulating digital markets, these big kind of highly concentrated markets that we see in the tech sector. And then we obviously have artificial intelligence and data protection legislation. So to kind of take each of those in turn, so under the online safety argument, the UK has actually in many ways gone a lot further than the European Union when it came to the obligations that were on technology companies, particularly when it comes to protecting children and managing online content. So in that way, the UK hasn't been this nimble, fleet of foot country on the edges of Europe. It's actually imposing a much more strict regime than the Digital Services Act. So that's a bit jarring with the narrative. When it comes to the Digital Markets Act and the UK's digital markets units in the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill, that's probably your more typical Brexit story, where the UK has gone for a more nimble, more proportionate, more focused version of the EU's approach, with a regulator which is quite beefed up in terms of staff and capability relative to what it's doing. So that sort of fits the divergence narrative a bit. You've then got the data bill, which the UK is just about to finish, hopefully before the summer, where we started out with kind of big narrative about the UK doing data protection law very differently, but it's slowly over time become a bit closer to what the EU is doing. And what we've seen is a bit more of a kind of removing the kind of grit from the gears of the old machine rather than buying a new engine, if you know what I'm saying. They've tried to speed it up, but they haven't fundamentally changed the regime. And this was largely because of concerns about data adequacy, which is effectively, if listeners don't know, a kind of free trade agreement, but for data flows. And there was concerns that the UK might lose that if it diverged too far. Now, the area where the UK is probably doing the best when it comes to its kind of strategic divergence is on artificial intelligence. And this is where, in many ways, because the EU moved really early and really quickly on this kind of regulation, the UK has kind of drawn dividends by sitting back a bit and saying, okay, we're going to take this a bit more slowly. We're going to think about how AI fits into our broader regulatory framework. And we've seen that, unlike with the GDPR, where that EU digital regulation kind of shot around the world, and we saw lots of countries complying and signing up to GDPR standards, the EU AI Act has not got to the same level of global adoption. In fact, you hear countries, when you go to talk at multilateral forums like Japan and others, saying we're not touching the EU AI Act. We think that's potentially going to be very bad for our domestic industries. And so we've got a much more contested global environment, and the UK is emerging alongside Australia and some others as having a very proportionate and flexible approach to AI regulation. So that is probably the one that fits the most into this divergence narrative. But I think we have to remember that even though in this area the UK is probably achieving the most from diverging with the European Union, there are still big costs applied to the tech sector as a result of Brexit. Digital services are not just digital. They often mean that, or digital and tech services are not just digital. It often means moving people and equipment across borders. And that's where you hit the problems that Brexit arises in terms of moving professional people across borders, the impact on moving goods. And we also saw some really big costs applied to the tech sector because of the debacle over the UK CE mark, because every tech product, if you look in the back of your phone, has a CE mark, and the tech sector was really frustrated with the CE mark debacle. So it's a bit of a kind of mixed picture. And just to throw in one last point, which is the kind of the counterfactual, which I think is quite important here. The UK had a really outsized voice when it came to discussions in the European Union around tech policy. And in particular, the UK was really influential when it came to those GDPR negotiations. And you've got to think, had the UK remained in the European Union, what would some of its digital legislation look like going forward? It is not sort of beyond the imagination to say that actually the EU AI Act, the Digital Markets Act, might be a lot softer in implementation had the UK still been inside the European Union. So we'll never know kind of what the outcome would have been had we stayed, but it's a bit more of a messy picture than often is portrayed.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. We've had sort of quite a lot of different sort of degrees of divergence, whatever. I'm just going to pick off a few sort of questions about where we are now. Joel, I fear most of these will be bombarded at you, but feel free to pick anyone to pass them on. Anonymous, which I usually think is code for civil servant, but who knows? Maybe just someone shy. Adherence to level playing field provisions. How prominent do we expect that to be in the 2026 TCA review? And just a sort of question, I know we've had a blog on this, to what extent are some of Keir Starmer saying, I'm going to remove all this annoying environmental stuff that's getting in the way of my 1.5 million homes I've ordered Angela Rayner to build? To what extent is that going to raise hackles within the EU? Is that likely to lead to any retaliation or anything, or cause problems in the TCA review?
No, I don't think so. So firstly, I mean, the TCA review, I don't think is going to be much of an event at all. I think it's going to be largely a box ticking exercise. Is it working? Is it being implemented as intended? Maybe some procedural changes, but not much more than that. The real meat of the review of the relationship is right now is this 19th of May summit and agreements that are taken forward from there. In terms of level playing field, for the uninitiated, it's basically a commitment to maintain parity of standards in a range of sectors, including climate, labour rights, etc. And those were actually the only real constraints on the UK's ability to diverge post-Brexit. And, you can't reduce compared to where you were at the point the TCA was signed your climate commitments, for example. But in reality, 2 points. One is that actually the UK and EU are really quite aligned on a lot of stuff, and it's kind of taken Brexit to emphasize the extent of that. I think kind of Neil's examples are quite a good point here, that even on tech and AI regulation, yes, there are some differences in what the UK wants to do and a slightly softer approach, but the direction of travel in terms of trying to sort of curtail the power of the largest tech companies is broadly speaking the same. And that principle applies across most sectors, to be honest. Climate is another area where the UK and EU and energy both consider themselves to be real global leaders. And the second point that's important is that level playing field is also it's quite political. There's not really some kind of perfect calculation at which you say, okay, now the level playing field has been tilted 2% too much towards the UK or whatever. You can kind of turn as much of a blind eye as you want to these issues. Subsidies would be a good example. I think there's a very strong case to be made that the EU state aid regulation changes during the pandemic were a significant violation of level playing field commitments, but no one chose to kind of make it into an issue. And probably you kind of see, exceptional circumstances. There's, do we want to ruffle these feathers, or do we kind of is this the battle that we want to pick, or do we want to focus on something else? And so I would imagine that if relations remain on a fairly smooth footing and conversations are positive, constructive about a deeper relationship over time, are you really going to quibble over a couple of habitats directives? I don't know. Maybe some member state gets really annoyed, but there's a tremendous amount of sort of political space to bury these things if you have an interest in doing so.
Okay, and a couple of questions from Mark English. A lot of interest in alignment and possibility of dynamic alignment, but actually how alignment might work in practice. Joel, you've mentioned the product regulation metrology bill, that really interesting thing that the government snuck into the King's speech. It's currently going through Parliament. Do we know very much about how the government thinks alignment might work in practice? Mark's just said, actually, you can align with regulations which are directly implemented, but directives are transposed in different ways in different member states. Do we have any clue how that all might work, and what happens when actually it falls to a devolved competence rather than to a UK competence, which quite a lot of this stuff does? I promise this is the most nerdy question you're going to get today.
Yeah,
well, I'm not promising, actually. I'm not promising, but yeah.
Serious detail. Okay, well, key point, it depends on what alignment we're talking about. There's a difference between a mutually agreed sort of deal between the UK and the EU and the stuff that the UK does voluntarily. So a mutual deal is the SPS agreement, for example. Yeah. So you agree, the UK agrees to harmonise its regulations with the EU. And what that means is the UK is more or less obliged to implement current and future EU legislation in the field of animal and plant health. And so the UK will be notified of this, but it still will have to go through the process of manually implementing, passing the necessary legislation. That's not always easy. If you look at a country like Norway, which is part of the kind of aligned to most of the single market, in the single market, even then it still has, it doesn't just, this legislation doesn't fall on Norway by magic. It still has to implement it. And sometimes there are quite significant delays, especially if it involves primary legislation. And so potentially, yeah, you do have some kind of conflicts between, well, to give a concrete example, Northern Ireland, which this EU legislation automatically applies, and the UK may be applying it slightly more slowly via its own legislation. You could have a gap where GB is not applying something, but Northern Ireland is, or there's an amendment to the GB legislation, and that creates some kind of technical difference. So yeah, it's not some kind of perfect blanket that's going to cover the entire UK. There are still going to be these kind of tricky, thorny legislative procedural issues in play. And then on the voluntary stuff, I'll keep this brief, but effectively, yeah, this is the UK not being told to do it by the EU, but choosing to copy it so that businesses know whether they're operating in GB, EU, or NI, it's the same standard. That just makes life easy and predictable. And I think there the main challenge is capacity, because it's not necessarily that easy to keep a track of all the EU legislation, decide where there's divergence that you want to address by copying the EU regulations, and then implementing the necessary legislation. So it's quite a big job. And at a time when the government is cutting civil service headcounts, cutting departmental budgets, has a number of other, really big agendas on the go, also wants to be looking at deregulation in other areas, got all this planning reform, huge projects. Like, does it really have the capacity in the system to do this voluntary alignment properly? Because it takes a lot of people to keep a track of and implement those changes.
Well, it takes you to keep track of them, Joel, which you do a fantastic job of. It's sort of slightly remarkable that there doesn't seem to be many other people doing it quite the same way. That point about capacity there relates to another question we've had as we stick with where we are. We are going to come on to the future from JWV. Have we lost economies of scale in that our regulators are smaller, less well-resourced than EU agencies, always in catch-up or cut and paste mode? Joel, I'm going to park you and go around our subject experts just from their perspective. David, regulators, have we lost important regulatory capacity, or are we nimbler, fleeter of foot, smaller and more dynamic?
Well, a bit of both. I mean, if we look at, the chemical sector, what what a difficult process that has been to actually building up regulatory capacity in the UK, and the huge cost of it in sort of rebuilding a database. So losing out from the economies of scale, as it was put, of that EU-wide system, as I think being very, very disruptive. In other cases, when we talk about subsidies control, if we can move more quickly and nimbly, then yes, that's possibly a benefit. So again, the recurring theme here is that it's a bit of a patchwork and a mixed picture. But more broadly, the more divergence there is, the greater the disruption for business and the greater the barrier to trade. So, trying to, on the one hand, regulate in a way which suits UK businesses, but on the other hand, not putting in place very significant costs is an issue. I think one of my concerns is whether we're actually in a position to be doing the kind of cost-benefit analysis at scale to really understand whether a regulation is intelligent in the UK context, if we're doing it differently from the European Union. So yes, I think there is a danger actually that we are kind of losing economies of scale in terms of regulation, and also that the setup costs we've really massively underestimated, I think.
Okay, Neil, you seem to be quite positive on digital regulation and our new setup.
Yeah, so there are some clear benefits to being outside the European framework, but the undoubted loss of regulatory capacity and the fact that regulators have to keep up with the same sort of stuff that we're doing in the European Union can have knock-on effects. So in particular, when you speak to technology companies, often they're concerned sort of principally about two things, which is the sort of the behavior of the regulator, how it's interacting with them, how expert it is, how it's crafting regulation, and also how quickly it comes to approve and make clear decisions. And ultimately, a lot of that can be backed up by the fact that it's having to deal with just a much bigger caseload because they're operating on their own rather than part as a bigger European bloc. So there's been some evidence for where that's had an effect within the MHRA and also within the Food Standards Agency, which sort of famously has been pointed to as not moving quick enough to help the UK take advantage of hormone-grown beef meat, lab-grown meats, etc. While this will probably not be a case for sort of the bigger regulators in the digital space, so the ICO, Ofcom, the CMA, and the FCA are really well resourced and are handling this relatively well. Some of those slowdowns, the kind of the lack of expertise, lack of good decisions, or lack of speedy approvals will get passed down to our smaller patchwork of regulators, of which the UK has, up to 100 in total. And we've got to remember that in the UK, we've chosen a particular approach to regulating artificial intelligence that pushes the decisions down to the regulators. So you're going to have to work out how to speed up that process and ensure expertise across a big constellation of regulators to get consistent, good artificial intelligence regulation across the economy, which is where the real benefits come from. So yes, there's an upside, but also there is a downside embedded into the fact that regulators have to do more with less.
That is quite interesting because, of course, Keir Starmer's talking about rationalising the regulatory landscape and also taking decisions back to ministers for accountability reasons, and clearly quite frustrated, Sarah, with the performance of some of the UK regulators not being quite pro-growth enough. Are our regulators suffering from Brexit, or can they be reorientated more easily into pro-growth mode post-Brexit? That's what the government wants.
Yeah, so in financial services, there were certainly quite a lot of reports relatively close to when the UK left about capacity issues in financial services regulators, really struggling to attract the number of people, probably partly due to the remuneration structures in the sector, needed to actually regulate financial services. So I think that was one issue. I think the second issue that financial services regulators faced that as a result of Brexit was the loss of UK influence in shaping EU financial services regulation. So rather like in tech that Neil spoke about, the UK played an outsized role in shaping EU financial services regulation. And that was a kind of a central plank in the kind of international power of UK as a financial services regulator. I think they were the big two issues. I think one of the changes, though, that came about possibly earlier in financial services compared to other sectors was the relationship between regulators and growth, coming back to your question. So in 2023, the financial services regulators were given growth and international competitiveness as a secondary objective. So although the discussion around Starmer's aspiration that regulators regulate for growth is a really live discussion now. In financial services, that discussion happened, or at least started, kind of 2-3 years ago. And I think we can learn some quite helpful lessons from that discussion. The big one in financial services was the trade-off that potentially gives you in terms of growth on the one side and consumer protections on the other. And I think that's being echoed in some other sectors now. So there was quite a lot of concern that if financial services regulators were given this secondary objective, it could lead to lower consumer protections for us in terms of our personal finances. Financial institutions would be encouraged to take more risks, and that could lead to kind of banking crises in a worst case scenario. There's some work going on at the moment that's trying to look at the extent to which the financial services regulators have effectively used these secondary objectives to deliver growth. What it means in practice is when they're making a regulatory decision, they have to include a sort of review of what it would mean, a concern for what it would mean in terms of growth. I think the big challenge in terms of, like, in a broad sense, using regulation for growth is that often regulation there is to maintain like a minimum standard of safety in whatever sector it is. So, like, if you're labeling baby food, to take an example that was in the news recently, you want to know what the minimum standards are to kind of deliver safe food. In financial services, regulation is there at its most basic to kind of control who's delivering financial services, to kind of underscore the quality of financial service advice you get, and to maintain the stability of the financial system. And we've seen what can go wrong with that. So I think there is a bit of a challenge in how you can use regulation to deliver growth, particularly when, as David was alluding to, in some sectors, kind of stability and certainty and a clear direction of travel might actually be the best way in which growth is delivered. So if you ask people, why has London maintained its position within the international financial system post-Brexit, one of the factors that's often identified is that the UK was seen as a stable regulator, and kind of certainty of direction, a sort of sense of proportionality, was kind of embedded into the regulatory system. So I think that remains a challenge in terms of, if you want to point to it like a specific regulatory change that's going to deliver growth, that might be difficult, because in some sectors, actually delivering certainty and stability might be one of the clearest ways of delivering growth and investment.
That's very interesting. Joel, Sarah was saying, certainty, stability, but obviously we're approaching, with ever-increasing excitement, at least in UK and a changing Europe, the 19th May summit, Brexit reset, future directions. So in your report, as well as looking back, you look forward to some of the options that the UK might have within existing UK red lines of not rejoining the single market or the customs union. So where might regulatory cooperation with the EU go? What do you think is on the cards?
Okay, I think it's helpful to answer this question by kind of thinking at it from a government perspective, and what options do you kind of have on the table potentially. And I think the key point or the key term is this term that Nick Thomas-Simmons has used, where he talks about ruthless pragmatism. And it's basically this idea that we're not going to change the fundamentals of the relationship with the EU. The TCA is here to stay. We're not rejoining the single market. We're not going to form a customs union. And so effectively, then you have a number of different sort of trading and defense areas where you can choose, if you like, to try and deepen your cooperation in specific areas. And so to me, this ruthless pragmatism thing is about deciding which areas do we want to go closer in, which areas do we want to maintain more autonomy, and where we do want to go closer, how are we going to go about it? So broadly speaking, I think it's quite obvious where the government wants to go now to get closer: an SPS deal, an emissions trading deal to avoid some of those kind of potential tariffs on carbon intensive goods that will come in from next year under the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, cooperation on security and defence, and some cooperation on energy as well. I think seems quite likely to again improve the efficiency of energy trading to bring down costs for producers and consumers. So I guess that's where kind of the core of the closer work is. And then I think we're looking at slightly more autonomy on financial services, other services sectors where the UK might think it can get benefits by not aligning itself with the EU. And also potentially it's where they might want to align more closely with the United States in order to get some kind of trade partnership deal agreement, whatever you want to call it. So I think that's the important demarcation. And then the second question is what does alignment look like? And broadly speaking, I would say that where the UK wants to go closer with the EU, it's accepting this principle that it involves what we call dynamic alignment. So that means signing up to EU regulations with no say over them now and into the future, because you can do other kinds of agreement, types of mutual recognition, as it's called, where you acknowledge your standards as equivalent, but unless you actually sign up to the rule book, you don't wipe away the most significant chunk of the barriers to trade. So I think, for example, in SPS, that's the kind of agreement that we're going to be moving towards. So effectively, the government there is making a trade-off between regulatory autonomy and ease of access to the European market. And so that is a decision you've got to make, and it's a decision where Labour is clearly falling in a different position to the Conservatives. And I think it's an interesting question about, are they going to try and build this over time into a wider patchwork? So we almost look a bit like Switzerland, where we have lots of sector-specific deals with the EU, or are they going to just rest on these few things which have been briefed to the press in the last few months?
Also an interesting question whether the EU lets us build a patchwork of sector-by-sector deals. Neil, quite a lot of questions coming up about your area, and Joel mentioned the sort of UK not exactly trying to play both sides, but caught between very differing approaches, particularly on tech, digital, between also on agri-food. But let's talk about tech, digital, because you probably don't want to talk about agri-food standards, between the US with very clear sort of interests and the EU pulling both ways, but also with public opinion as quite a big player. And as Sarah was mentioning on the banker's bonus cap, potential constraint on the government's freedom of manoeuvre. Would you like to just take us through, if you were there in government, how would you be thinking through the optimal path on tech that you would like to secure here?
Everyone is sort of looking both directions when it comes to this. How is the UK going to manage the US and the EU? My sort of rough suspicion is that actually we will see stuff given away on tech in a US discussion to then try and support other sectors, because it's interesting, everyone kind of talks about this big sort of digital agreement, but actually the main benefit that the UK gets from tech agreements with the US often falls outside of free trade agreements. Free trade agreements, as everyone knows, are traditionally about removing quotas and tariff barriers and discrimination clauses. And actually the UK and the US have very good, quite open markets with each other. So the amount you would gain from a full digital free trade agreement is quite limited outside of possibly.
So what do giveaways look like? Does that mean that sort of, all the stuff we've seen, all this agonizing process around the Online Safety Bill, Online Safety Act, I suppose I should now call it, it was a bill for so long that I forget to call it, that it's actually been enacted. Do we have to sort of lighten up and stop finding tech firms for publishing harmful content? Does it mean we have to give up the revenues and digital services tax? I mean, what substantive differences might we be forced to concede as part of a tech agreement with the US?
I think ultimately, if there's going to be some kind of deal, the UK will probably give up the digital services tax. That's been very heavily telegraphed anyway. When it comes to things like the competition regulation and the Online Safety Act, I don't think you're going to see big changes to the legislation itself, mainly because, as people are rightly pointing out in the chat, there would be a huge backlash in Parliament against potentially changes to the Online Safety Act. The Online Safety Act has one thing in it which US Republicans up to the vice presidential level care a lot about, which is around sort of freedom of speech and censorship. Now, the Act doesn't do a huge amount in that space, but there's probably some things that the government might want to give away or signal that it wants to look at as a consequence. but still making sure that the kind of the protections for children basically remain in place as much as they're going to be. It's worth saying that the UK's got an incentive to do a deal with the EU when it comes to tech as well, which is in the spring statement we saw recently. There was a big announcement from the Treasury about putting 10% of the Ministry of Defence's budget into defence technology. And one thing that the UK will want from the European Union is access to that EU defence fund. And that will be a really important thing for UK-based technology companies that produce dual-use goods, which could be used in multiple settings. So there is something to gain from the EU as well, which may be given up when it comes to kind of assuaging. So you've probably gained something in the EU when it comes to tech, while giving up things on tech to get benefits for other sectors when it comes to the US.
And can we have our cake and eat it on tech? You seem to be suggesting that the US and the EU have sufficiently different interests that we can actually do a deal with the US and do something else with the EU on defence tech. Is that feasible, or will the EU start threatening data adequacy, as you mentioned earlier, if we go too light on tech? Because they seem to be limbering up to target tech as part of their retaliatory measures if it comes to that.
I think the UK can carefully have its cake and eat it if it plays its cards right. But you can see a situation where things start to go wrong very quickly if it's not calibrated properly.
Okay, so careful cake in tech. David, nothing that Joel suggested, apart from maybe a bit of energy cooperation, do much for your guys. Where would they like the reset to go in manufacturing?
So certainly, I think the energy cooperation could help, because otherwise, if we don't align our emissions trading systems and ultimately a carbon border adjustment mechanism, then manufacturers here could face a kind of double whammy of costs of having to pay a high price for carbon here and then pay to enter the EU market. So I think that would actually help.
Even if they have to pay a higher price for carbon now, because the price under the EU ETS is so much higher than the price under the UK ETS now.
That can go either way, of course. So there have been times when our price has been higher, so that can go either way. But so I think that could potentially help longer term. I think for certain sectors like automotive, chemical, pharma, aviation, then aligning with the EU would actually help them in terms of what we're talking about, of clarity, certainty, reducing extra costs. So that I think that would be very helpful for them. There's still the chance to do deals to eliminate tariffs. I mean, there's this issue in the car industry at the moment of Trump putting in place a 25% tariff. There's a deal to be done there whereby we reduce tariffs down to zero, and the US does the same. We can have tariff-free trade on cars, but we would still have to respect each other's standards. And the bottom line is, when it comes to manufacturing, there are these two big regulatory powers, the US and the EU. And we're in the EU's orbit most of the time because we trade with them so much, but we're in the US's orbit when we come to trade with them. So essentially, we've got to kind of allow as much access as possible to those markets while recognizing that ultimately they set the regulations.
Okay, Joel wants to come in, but I'm just going to ask you one more question, David. Adrian Wyatt's asked, shouldn't the UK just recognise all standards of all countries and the European single market for all trade agreements for goods and services? I mean, yeah, we've already seen that we do recognise, CE marks, we recognise other bits of European certification. What would your manufacturing guys think of us just doing that?
I'm not quite sure how far he's going there. Is that for everywhere?
Don't know either,
everything? Or I think for certain sectors that there is scope to look at that. I mean, I think coming back to Joel's point about are we going to end up with more of a Swiss type arrangement, then ultimately I think that's going to be the direction of travel, whereby you align some sectors quite closely to reduce the costs for business and trade, and in other cases you say, well, actually we aren't going to align and we want to do things quite differently. So you can imagine this kind of piece of Swiss cheese, as it were, with holes in it. So that's ultimately where I think we will get to if we continue down this line. Of course, government attitudes can change, as we saw with the previous administration.
Okay, so we've got Kate, we've got some, is it Gruyere or is it Emmental or whatever, whichever one it is. Joel, you wanted to come in, and then I'm going to come on to Sarah about what financial services might want.
Yeah, just on manufacturing, I think it's striking how little there is in that sector, considering they've suffered sort of disproportionately from Brexit compared to services trade. But I think one big missing thing, which is potentially worth sort of watching out for in the future, is mutual recognition of conformity assessment, because that is one of the things that Switzerland has with the EU. It's one of the key kind of patchwork deals that it has, and it comes back to that point Neil was making about having to get all your tech goods stamped with a UK or EU mark. So if you have mutual recognition in a Swiss style, at least, what that means is a UK CA mark would be sufficient to sell your goods into the EU market, which it's not at the moment. We accept the EU CE mark stuff, but they don't accept our stuff. So that would be a potentially significant benefit to manufacturers, and especially those with complex integrated supply chains that are moving across the border a lot.
So
But
the
of course,
FT
it means
yesterday,
alignment with EU regulations.
yeah. So the FT yesterday said that the EU wasn't interested in giving us mutual recognition conformity assessment, which I think even David Frost asked for. Why not?
So what the UK
One
asked for,
sentence.
what the UK asked for was a different type, which is a Canada-style thing,
Yeah.
which is where a UK body could administer the UK stamp and the EU stamp simultaneously. And the EU isn't interested in that because basically you're taking business away from the EU companies that currently do that administration. So you don't want to move it over to the UK.
So a bit of protectionism there. Sarah, financial services, and what about one of the things the government did say it was going to ask for in its manifesto, which was mutual recognition of professional qualifications. Is that going to happen?
So I think that has been widely trailed as being likely within the reset. This would basically mean that a lawyer, architect's probably a better example, trained in the UK could more easily have their qualifications recognised by an EU member state. That actually doesn't do a whole lot for financial services because they don't hold qualifications in that sense to practice as a financier. And the thorny issue is that to deliver the full economic benefit of a MRPQ, you need mobility arrangements around it. And we can see in the press at the moment that the concerns around how mobility brushes up against the migration figures is a real challenge. I think financial services are taking this longer view. I don't think the sort of May summit is going to be the moment at which we see like a really significant statement on financial services. But I do think there is a longer term trend around the two regulatory systems starting to have more in common. And I think building on the regulatory dialogues, I think that if the government interests remain as they are, would be the pathway for financial services. And Switzerland actually provides a really clear example of what that looks like in what some would argue is its most developed form. So Switzerland and the UK have what's called a Bern Agreement, which was signed very recently. It's super innovative in terms of regulatory alignment. So it doesn't align on a line-by-line basis in terms of regulation. It takes an approach that's called in the lingo substantive deference, but that basically means it's an outcomes-based approach to regulation. So it's looking at whether the outcomes of regulations are aligned or not. And this gets you out of a question of dynamic alignment. It has dispute resolution, and it takes a much broader approach. It took a long time to negotiate between the UK and the EU. And requires a high degree of trust between the two parties. But the UK has innovated there in terms of the kind of regulatory agreement that it's struck with Switzerland. And I think that could be an opportunity in the longer term.
Of course, something the UK repeatedly asked for early on was recognising different ways of achieving the same outcomes, and the EU made it pretty clear wasn't up for that back then, but that was a long time ago. Okay, one thing we've only got 2 minutes left, so I want each of you to say one thing that you think is going to be super interesting in the regulatory space in the next year. Neil, what's the most interesting thing we should all be watching out for that we haven't thought of or discussed so far?
I think it's looking at this question around artificial intelligence and intellectual property, which is starting to gather pace both in the UK, but has been a long featured discussion in the European Union. There's also court cases in the US, and it feels like this is all about to kind of kick off in a much bigger global discussion.
Brilliant. David?
So we are, as you noted earlier, Jill, awaiting the government's industrial strategy. That is targeted around certain missions. So it's a mission-oriented approach. So in terms of the kind of reset that we're going into, is the alignment or divergence that we are going to see in different areas kind of matching the different missions within that industrial strategy, which is meant to drive growth. So do the two kind of marry up?
Okay, Sarah.
I think green finance is fascinating because that's an area where standards are being set now. And there's kind of interesting debates about, European standards, US standards, and how the UK sits between those. And so I think it's like real world important, but also has really interesting like regulatory questions in terms of the different powers' direction of travel.
Very interesting to see if Mark Carney uses his new mandate to revolutionize that, and we will have to align on a Canada model. Joel, final comment, or just plug your report for next week?
I'm going to say energy. I think there's a clear mutual ambition to go further, to trade more efficiently, to build more capacity in the North Sea, but there are regulatory obstacles in the way that, not for want of trying, officials haven't been able to work their way around so far. So I think that's going to need quite a creative, potentially ambitious solution, more engagement with the EU internal energy market. So I think we're not hearing too much about that yet, but I think that will be one to watch.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to thank you all on behalf of the audience. Thank you for so many questions. There were loads and loads of questions. Thought none were coming, but then we had a veritable deluge. Watch out for the report published on the 6th of May. On the same day, I think, at lunch hour, at least same time next week, we're going to be discussing the outcome of the local elections and what that might mean for the future of British politics. So keep watching, lots more reports and events coming from UK in a changing Europe in the coming months. So thank you all very much for listening, and tell all your friends they can watch this on our YouTube channel at leisure and dissect all those fascinating answers again. Thanks very much, Neil, Joel, Sarah, and David.
Thank you.